understand who they are religiously. Also, if you're new to the channel, check out the playlist. Go to Parenting Skills Muslims Need. It is a free course that I live streamed over the summer that teaches Muslim parents everything that I know that they need to know about young people and how to interact with them so we can have successful relationships with our families. Plugs out of the way. Jazakumullah khairan to everyone's here. If you are here, please put the salam in the chat. Also, if you have any questions at any point about this topic concerning drugs and what we do with family members who are having issues with it, which is often very shocking in Muslim families, please feel free to put comments and questions in the chats. Dr. Abu Isa, assalamu alaikum.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, Michael. How's it going?
Walaikum assalam. So thank you so much for being here, brother. This is a topic we touched on it in the podcast we did in late June a little bit, and just talking about mental health and mental illness in general. And you mentioned how, substance abuse is one of your rising concerns with Muslim families that you've seen both in the UK and the Muslim world. For me here in the state of Minnesota, America, certainly marijuana addiction and opioid addiction as well. It's stuff that I deal with every year with at least some students in my work as a public school teacher. So it's a rising issue. And of course, people want to know what to do about it. So I also did a broadcast with our brother, Mr. Middlepath, where he talked very extensively about the damage of marijuana. And, subhanAllah, drugs are just very pernicious. And even me, when I was first reading the Quran, when I discovered it in college, and I had prior experience, of course, with people being addicted to drugs, here in America, pretty much every family is touched by drug addiction, one way or the other, if not, perhaps by multiple people. Actually, it's amazing to me the way the Quran describes drugs, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says there's some good in it, but the harm outweighs the benefits. So it's forbidden, and describes, khamr as being something that the shaitan uses to sow discord between mankind. And, that was amazing for me to read back because when you grow up Christian, you think of religious texts as being just kind of esoteric and not actually relating to real life in a big way. But the wisdom in reading that, is very profound, and we're experiencing it in our lives. So, talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in your practice as far as drug addiction in Muslim families. And then, we want to get into what families can do about it when they have a family member who's going through this.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Michael. I think it's a really important topic, which, as you mentioned, we previously touched on superficially, and perhaps we may need to do one or two other episodes addressing this, because it's a wide-ranging topic with a lot to discuss. But just to kind of give an overview, the first thing is it's a very stigmatizing subject, not only amongst the Muslim community, but also the non-Muslim community. So it's stigmatizing, and I think these kind of podcasts are really important to destigmatize this issue, because as with a lot of so-called taboo subjects, the Muslim parents and family members, they shy away from discussing these things. And I think that's the wrong approach. I don't know what your opinion is, but definitely I think we need community leaders, we need educators, we need imams to talk about these issues, because it's all well and good, giving kind of khutbahs which are iman boosting, but the Prophet ﷺ, he used to tackle the issues in the community, and I think we need to do that as well. We need to follow that same methodology. And subhanAllah, if you actually look at, there is hadith about one particular Sahabi that used to have an issue with alcohol. I think his name was Nu'aym. I need to check that. And he always used to relapse, become intoxicated, and the Sahaba would curse him and bring him to the Prophet ﷺ multiple times. And then on one occasion, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, look, I know for a fact that he loves Allah and His Messenger, so don't curse him. So, it's a problem which is pervasive and been present for, thousands of years. So anyway, getting back to where we are, worldwide, the commonest substances that are used or abused are alcohol, marijuana, and obviously nicotine, which I don't think we'll talk about too much today. And then currently in the world, especially in the US, there's an opioid epidemic. So I was looking at the data actually preparing for this stream. So if you go to the National Institute of Drug Addiction, NIDA has really good resources for any parents or educators that want to look at the most recent data. And they were on their website, they mentioned that around 100,000 people died from drug overdoses in 2020 in the US.
Yeah. And those numbers increased. I know
Yes.
locally here in Minneapolis, and our city was kind of devastated with fallout of George Floyd and COVID and stuff. We had even higher numbers with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that just kind of gives you the scale of the issue. And I think it's very topical in the US about fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, which is extremely potent and toxic, much more than heroin, and is causing a lot of overdoses and deaths. So now I'm not sure in your school, I'm sure you've got Narcan, which is readily available across in public spaces because so many people are just presenting, with opioid overdoses. So, yeah, subhanAllah. So I think marijuana is a big issue we can talk about, and I think opioids is probably something we should talk about, and alcohol as well. So amongst the Muslim community, because both in the Gulf as well as in the UK, these are the commonest substances that Muslim families are affected by. Yeah.
So, I remember speaking with a young person last year who had an older brother, early 20s, she asked me, what can we do? He's smoking marijuana every day, and he's moved out, he's lived on his own. What sort of upset me about what she said was, I asked her about, do your parents know about this type of thing? And she said, yeah, but my dad just kind of says, what can I do? He's on his own now, he makes his own decisions. This is a Muslim family, obviously. And, you asked me my opinion on the stigmatization, this type of thing. I mean, I know it's stigmatized amongst Muslims. I am a little wary of Muslims thinking that they have some sort of special problem that the non-Muslims don't. It's plenty stigmatized about amongst non-Muslims. I mean, not talking about it in non-Muslim families is a huge thing that has allowed it to become so pervasive. And what I heard in that young person who approached me about it, asking about her brother and the way she described her father, is this sort of withering away of care. That's what I've seen in non-Muslim families who've undergone this stuff in generations. Like you have a family member who's literally ruining their life with this type of thing, and the other family members, what they do is they essentially disattach themselves from caring from that other person. And Western individualism kind of lends itself towards that. So it's like, okay, we're all individuals. He or she's an individual, so they do what they have to do, or they're just gonna do what they do. It's not really my thing. I think where things are problematic in a lot of Muslim cultures is sometimes people who are victimized by this type of thing, or young people who are struggling, they maybe perceive families' anxiety about it and their stigma about it only as a sort of status thing. I think that can be a problem when it's like, we don't want to talk about this because we're afraid. The issue is we're afraid what other people are going to think about it. I do think that's a problem. And when you send that message to a young person, and even things just pertain to practicing of the deen, young Muslims experience this a lot, where it's like, okay, mom, you want me to look a certain way when we're around certain people, but otherwise it doesn't matter. So you just care about what other people think. And that's part of the way that young people sense hypocrisy in their parents, and that they can connect to like not being a genuine care. So I think with Muslims, we do have to start talking about it, and we have to be, we have to understand that we can't let go of our care for one another, and we certainly cannot let go of our care for our children. So I think it begins there. And I think a lot of parents and families, obviously they do care, but then they don't know what to do. So, when I think about a drug intervention, and I'm not an expert in it at all, but I know some things that I've heard, read, seen. And certainly with alcohol, and in both my family, my wife's family, there's people who've been through that for sure. You think about, actually more traditionally, you think about the whole family gathering with that person and telling them how their addiction is hurting them. Like each person kind of goes around. It's often like very emotional. It can be very hard for people to talk. A lot of times an expert like facilitates it. Like it might be
Yes.
something that a rehab expert or someone facilitates,
Yeah.
or a therapist, and they press the family members to pour their emotions out to the person. So it can be very hard. Nowadays I hear more about people just trying to send their child to a therapist or this type of thing. Those are my associations with intervening.
Yeah.
So I mean, what have you
Yeah.
seen in experience, and what do you recommend to families?
So I would always say, Michael, that prevention is better than cure. So if you look at the cases that I've dealt with, and both Muslim and non-Muslims, usually there is some sort of disruption in terms of the nurturing relationship within the family. So there may be some parental substance abuse. So we know from the evidence base that there are risk factors for young people using drugs.
Mm.
One of the key risk factors is if there's a parent or a family member that's abusing drugs in the home.
Mm.
Certainly, I've seen 12 and 13-year-old Muslim boys injecting heroin because their father is a heroin abuser and their uncles are heroin abusers and their cousins are heroin users. So um, that's a risk factor. The other thing is also, especially now, because we talk about this a lot. The situation is getting worse and worse worldwide in terms of the fitna is coming thick and fast. Our youth are being attacked with the LGBTQ issue, with the drug abuse issue, with atheism and creating doubts in the deen. I'm talking specifically about Muslim youth. So I think we're living in unprecedented times. I mean, there's always been fitna. That's the nature of this dunya. But I think where our youth are being, I mean, when we were younger, we had issues to deal with. But I think now it's much more on a mega scale in terms of like the number and the intensity and the frequency of the fitna. And also, before you could be passive, right? You could say, okay, if you knew some people using drugs, you could like stay away from them. Yes. But now it's like, why are you not using drugs? We're using drugs, so you should. The peer pressure is more intense. That's what I found.
Amongst Muslims, you mean?
Amongst Muslims, definitely. So in that kind of environment, I think it's really important, and I always emphasize this. This is an intervention in itself, is to be first of all vigilant about your children, because I found that a lot of Muslim parents are just careless in terms of like they don't really. I mean, I was asked to do an intervention for a family from the US actually, Muslim family. I think they're Jordanian or Syrian, and they found out that their 18-year-old son was using marijuana. Okay. And subhanallah, like when I kind of dug deeper, like, okay, both the parents are working full time. And when I said, okay, so who is your son hanging out with? And the mother's like, I'm not too sure who his friends are.
Right.
And then she said, they're all non-Muslim as well. Sorry.
No.
And she. So my point was like, how can you not know who your son is hanging out with? Like as parents, we have a sense of responsibility and a duty of care, especially for when they're going through adolescence, which is a very sensitive period.
Correct.
And one of the risk factors and across the board is peer pressure. There's a lot of research and evidence that looks at why young people use drugs, and by far the highest kind of reason is peer pressure, because my friends are using drugs and I want to fit in and I want to conform to their attitude, and so they start using drugs.
Few things I want to say. I mean, you mentioned adolescence, something that I see so much in school, especially teaching high school, and I used to, my school used to have a middle school as well. Around middle school, early high school, a lot of parents, they really have this tendency of not wanting to monitor the child as much.
Yes.
And you've been doing a lot of parenting in their life, obviously, up to that point. A lot of parents have this rationale of like, well, they're older now, they got to learn how to do it on their own. So I just got to let them be, that type of stuff. Even if they struggle, that's good for them. That is really not a good attitude to take. It's really not a good idea. A lot of times it's an excuse to be lazy as a parent.
Yes.
And, and I'm talking about this, just say relative to schoolwork, like, oh, I'm not going to check his homework every day or whatever, this type of thing. It's really a bad idea. Like a lot of kids, they need a lot of help with the increased amount of organization they need to do at that time.
Exactly.
I'm talking about school here. So, and they will be more resistant, especially in those early teenage years towards it. And go to my parenting course, people, if you need help with this. But you have to monitor the kids at that age. The other thing I was going to say about peer pressure, something I've seen actually, because I mean, I've seen kids at different levels of involvement in drugs. Okay,
Sure.
there's and sometimes kids go through a progression where
Hmm.
they use it. Okay, they try it out with some kids who they hang out with sometimes. You know, they know them
Yeah.
from school, and those kids like invite them, and they get them in, and that might, that eventually increases to doing it more regularly. If you get into a social group where the social culture is that that's what you do, inevitably someone is going to be involved with selling it. And then
Yes.
you are involved in selling it already because you start buying it and not just using it with them. And then after buying it for a while, you might start selling yourself, and you eventually do that by trying to branch off and getting other people roped into it. Like this is like a general process that high
Yeah.
schoolers they go through
Yes.
all the time with drug addiction.
Yeah.
And there's a couple things about this. One thing I like to point out to people in education, some kids get a real rush out of this. It gives them a real feeling of independence, like when they can sell something and maybe make a little money off of it, or at least make enough money to not have to pay for drugs themselves. That's a little empowering. And they do learn some things about basic supply and demand economics that is some
Mm.
interesting learning. And the education system doesn't fill this gap, because the education system, certainly in America, it generally doesn't teach about making money. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of young kids who they're interested in that. So so
Mm.
so that's a whole educational aspect that needs to be filled with this. The other thing too, something I see here, working in Minneapolis, lower income kids who are highly targeted to like be roped into this type of thing. Sometimes the kids who are involved in the selling, they're very smart and clever. They
Yeah.
will target kids who have jobs. They're working jobs after school as a teenager, and a lot of times those kids they're decent kids and they're responsible in this type of thing. But the kids who are trying to sell, they know those kids are getting their own paychecks, so they know they have money, and that is part of the way to rope them in. So I mean, so just to make the point, even if you have a kid who is going to school all day and they're working a lot, it might seem like they're busy and they're really occupied with whatever's going on in life, so they're good, but even with them, it's really not the case. You know what's going on, daily check-ins and stuff.
Yeah. So it's really important to be vigilant and to really supervise as best as you can, your children, because at the end of the day, like you say, parents have a duty of care, so they can become parents can become lazy, and it's just too much of a headache, especially that adolescent period where
Mhm,
adolescents may likely to rebel and have this identity crisis. Muslim youth living in non-Muslim countries, for example. The other thing is also communication. I've heard you talk about this a lot. Having a communication that is open and frank with your children, so trying and nurturing that relationship so that they will come to you if they have any issue, any problem,
mhm,
irrespective of what it is. And I feel it too much. Parents follow this kind of authoritarian approach, Muslim parents, authoritarian approach where, like, I'm your father, you need to respect me. Yes,
yeah,
respect, but not to the point where they're scared to even like spend time with you or sit down at the table, just
mhm,
having a meal without speaking. So yes, it's a fine balance, but I think, and this is what our Deen teaches as well. The Prophet ﷺ, he never shouted at a child.
mhm,
Even there's many incidents. So it's about having a nurturing relationship so that your children can approach you whatever issue they have, and usually 9 times out of 10 they will disclose to you things that are going on.
mhm,
I've seen parents who have that relationship, and the young person will say, "Look, at school, somebody offered me marijuana. What should I do?" Or,
mhm,
I felt really uncomfortable, and they were putting pressure on me. Or, the people said, "Come to this party," and I did go to a party, and there was alcohol there, and I didn't know how to handle it. So, those kind of discussions are really important. But I think if they're too scared to speak to their parents, Muslim youth, then who are they going to talk to? They're going to talk to their peers who are going to misguide them usually, you know?
eh,
Um,
absolutely. And I will say too, those discussions, they're important not just for prevention of this issue, but a lot of times a kid, when they do have that first time that they're offered, they're too nervous or skittish or whatever and too young to actually accept it. A lot of times they will resist the first time. And if you can know about it, now you have a great opportunity to praise them and honor them, for making a correct decision and all this type of
yeah.
thing.
And I would even say that you should have these discussions with your child even before they face this issue. So
Yeah.
I was looking again some of the data. So just to mention so people are aware. 1 second, bear with me. So in the US, they've done surveys on substance abuse, and around a third of students reported that they've tried alcohol by 8th grade. Okay.
Yep.
By 12th grade, around 70% of youngsters have tried alcohol.
Yep.
12% of 8th graders and more than 50% of 12th graders have drunk at least once in their life. Okay. And the rates of marijuana has increased substantially, as we've discussed. So around 45% of 9th to 12th graders reported ever using marijuana. And 50% of 12th graders reported use of any illicit drugs. So you just kind of let that data sink in. So 1 out of 2 students are using drugs by the time they're in 12th grade.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think they've gotten a grasp of it, but certainly Muslim parents in America need to understand. I mean, just drinking especially, it's just always been a part of American adolescent culture. It's always been a big part of it, and just that still sits with it. And those numbers actually all used to be worse in previous generations. I argue the thing that's made it better has actually been the influx of immigrant families from conservative countries. But but those numbers will change as we go.
Yeah. So that's really important. I think, so having those conversations, again, we talked about like sex education, substance abuse, anything that a fitna you think you can affect your family. I think it's important that we talk to our children about, in conversations in a sensitive manner. But definitely, these are discussions that it might be uncomfortable for parents, but it's better to have that discussion and feel uncomfortable than have to firefight a crisis, years down the line because you couldn't, have the courage to have these discussions with your children. Especially for those people who are educating their children in the public school system. I mean, homeschooling has its advantages in that sense that they're not exposed as much to the peer pressure and the prevalent substance abuse, etc. But definitely and I think Sajid talks about this in his podcast as well, that if you do decide to educate your children in the public school system, which has its advantages, you need to be wary of the risks as well.
Yeah. And I generally tell parents, you're absolutely raising kids in a time where they need to know that dangers exist in the world. They can know that generally from a very young age. I always recommend to people, it's around age 9, 10 where kids have a greater awareness as far as peers. It's more simple at that time. But if they're going to school, that's when they're first going to see some kids trying to like disobey the teacher to show off in front of other kids. So you want to explain to your child before they're 9 how in the future you're going to see kids doing that, and and that's not something good to do, and it only increases from there. When it comes to age 9, 10, that really is, and it's at that age you want to talk about drugs and alcohol explicitly. And the thing is too, like you want to, and we talk about it a little bit in the podcast I did with Mr. Middlepath. But you want to talk about it like the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it, where he says there's some benefit in it, but the harm greatly outweighs the benefit. Because what I see kids go through is when they first try it, it will have a stimulating effect, or you'll feel some sort of pleasure from doing it. So if you've only been told up to that point that it's dangerous, stay away, it's going to kill you, all that type of stuff, and we know teenagers especially, it's part of their neurological makeup that they downplay risk, especially health risk, in their decision making. So if they've only been told bad health risks, it's bad for you, don't do it, and then they actually do try it and it feels like something good, along with that, they're going to feel like this sense of like, hey, they're going to feel a sense of empowerment. Like, I know something all those adults who are telling me this was bad don't know. I know too, something that has been studied is, tobacco use has greatly increased over the past 20 years in America. In the 80s and certainly the 90s, it was sky high. I remember going to high school in the 1990s, half the kids smoked cigarettes. And there's been public service announcements put out by the government, like commercial ads that warn against cigarette smoking since the 1980s in the United States. But for 2 decades, the 80s and 90s, they had pretty much zero effect. Teenage smoking only went up. Now, why? What's been found is because during that time, that messaging, it only focused on negative health effects of it. It just focused on the long-term health effects. Well, dismiss that. It's going to downplay that. In the early 2000s, the messaging switched to not focusing on the health effects, but rather focusing on the fact that the tobacco industry is trying to manipulate young people. And with just with a lot of things that go on with youth these days, they are trying to be manipulated. I mean, every
Yeah.
corporate entity that exists is trying to manipulate them, and the drug industry itself. You know, is things that the U.S. government could shut down and all this stuff. There's been times in history where they've let it proliferate in certain neighborhoods intentionally, all that type of stuff. You can talk about that type of thing with kids from a young age, and they need to
Yes.
understand that people involved in that have been manipulated. And
Yeah.
because that is something that teenagers don't want to feel, that like they're being
Yeah.
manipulated.
So I mean, it's a really good point. If you kind of you were talking about the neurobiology, really. So adolescence is a period where it's the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for kind of measuring risk taking. So the adolescence, the prefrontal cortex develops much slower than the rest of the brain. So there's a tendency to engage in impulsive and reckless behavior and risk taking behavior. And the neurobiology is really, subhanallah, you know, like the more you study science, the more it kind of firms up your iman. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about don't even come close to, you know, drugs and alcohol. Why? Because what we know now is that when you take that first hit or whichever drug it is, whether it's marijuana, alcohol, opioids, there's a rush of dopamine in your brain. Okay. So normal pleasurable activities like, I don't know, exercise, if somebody enjoys exercise, or spending time with your family, or whichever hobby you have, results in a release of dopamine. But the first time you take a drug, the dopamine goes through the roof, and it can't compete with natural pleasurable experiences. So subhanallah, so then you kind of get hooked onto that drug, and your brain is then basically asking you to go for the next hit and then go for the next hit, and then gradually over time you develop tolerance, which means that you need more and more of that drug to achieve that high that you had the first time you experienced it, which you will never get. It's like catching your shadow, basically. And then it gets to the point where you become physically dependent. So, you know, I'm sure you've seen documentaries and maybe movies of people going through withdrawal, opioid withdrawal or alcohol withdrawal.
I've seen it firsthand, brother.
Yeah.
You know, I've had students in the high school I work with where you have to have them on a special program for them to like visit the nurse's office regularly. You know, and this is especially with opioids. Like kids going through withdrawal from opioid addiction. They're in such a state they really cannot even go to school. Like they can't function.
They can't function. So what happens is over time it starts off as a pleasurable experience, but then your body becomes so dependent on that drug that the reason you take the drug is not to enjoy the drug, is to avoid the you know, the physical pain in terms of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, you know, sweating, tremors, subhanallah. And also I think that's really important to highlight, I think, because Muslims and even the average person may not know about the neurobiology of addiction and how you know that. So prevention is better than cure, like we talk about. If we can prevent young people to even try that drug the first time, that's the best intervention. And that's about, first of all, educating yourself. I think parents, they don't know much about drugs, and now there's a lot of resources. So we, as Muslim parents, we need to educate ourselves on you know, common drugs and what are the physical and psychological impacts of using drugs, and then impart that knowledge to our young, you know, our youth, in terms of, okay, look, these are the risks. And obviously, as Muslims, our framework is Islam, right? So we always start off as what Allah has defined as halal and what Allah has defined as haram. And what is the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined things as haram is because it's not good for us, right? Or good for society. And I think it's we can't detach Islam, because we know the stronger your iman, the less likely, that's a protective factor from these kind of issues.
It is. And khamr was the final prohibition.
Exactly.
In life
Exactly.
And
it was done in stages as well. So, you know, subhanAllah, like a lot of the Sahaba, they were addicted to alcohol, right? Because at that time, the society was basically alcohol. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew the psychology of human beings. And this is another intervention which we can talk about. Is we're now talking about prevention, but once somebody has that issue, how do we intervene? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that we can't ask somebody who's become addicted to just suddenly stop. There has to be a process, you know, of gradual reduction and harm minimization, and then abstinence after that. And why did the Sahaba stop drinking? You know, the narration of Medina was full of like, it was like a river of red wine, basically. Some of the Sahaba, they drank and they made themselves sick. Others smashed their vessels. because they had built up their iman and their taqwa to a level where when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, khalas, it's haram now, they accepted it, right? So that's really important as well, to nurture the iman of our children.
So this makes for the correct transition that I want to make, and the discussion about prevention is important. The reality is some people are going to watch this because they have a family member, maybe a child, maybe a sibling, who is
Yeah.
going through drug addiction. You mentioned recent, and we want to talk about what do you do in this situation, because people feel very lost. You mentioned that you recently were asked to intervene with someone who's an 18-year-old. Let's take that type of scenario. Okay, someone who's 18 to 24, which is a common age to be in addiction as well. And a lot of times, kids, they first got individual independence at those ages too. So I mean, and let's if we're doing an imaginary scenario, let's say marijuana. Okay, like with opioid addiction, the person usually becomes very, very low functioning. I think with marijuana and alcohol, it's a lot more likely to see someone who's functioning. Maybe I don't want to say high functioning, but functioning, like they can go through life. And you see a lot. Okay, 18 to 24-year-old males, they might have some sort of menial job, working at a cash register or something, a job that it doesn't involve too much intellectual work, so you can actually do it under the influence of marijuana. So they're using marijuana regularly. They're getting their own money. They've moved out from home. But this will lead to them failing to launch in life and get anywhere beyond it. So, the family's concerned, but they don't know what to do. Like, what would you advise a family who came to you with that type of issue?
Yeah, very good question. I think there's no one size fits all. So every family has their own particular dynamics. But the general kind of recommendation in terms of an intervention is first, and usually it's like a crisis situation. So like this case that I talked about, the mother suddenly found some cannabis paraphernalia, drug paraphernalia in the room of her son when she was cleaning up, right? So the first thing is parents go through this shock. Muslim parents that, oh my God, my son or my daughter is using drugs, right? And it doesn't matter if they're 18, 19, or if they're 16, that same kind of thought process they experience. And then what they tend to do is there tends to be a massive explosive argument. Oh, I found these drugs. Are you using drugs? How could you shame us? You're a Muslim. Kind of those negative emotions, which is natural for a parent to experience, which then results in usually the young person kind of just shutting down and because first of all, for them, if you put yourself in their perspective, they've built this kind of life where they've tried to please their parents, and then suddenly the parents have found out that they've done something which is quite humiliating for the individual, but also for the family. So a lot of the times, a young person will feel really bad and guilty that, look, I let my parents down, and perhaps I let Allah down in terms of using drugs. So they're already feeling quite guilty about it, and on top of that, the parents just attack them. That makes the situation much worse, and it can actually become irreparable. Where I've worked with cases where young people have just run away from home basically, and gone and lived outside. So that's the worst thing you can do. What I would recommend is if you're a family member and you find out that your son or your daughter, anybody in the family is using drugs, first take time out for yourself. Don't approach this subject straight away, because you're more likely to cause issues and arguments. You need to process that information. So I think that's the general recommendation I would give. Give yourself 24 hours, 48 hours to kind of just let that information sink in, and then try and arrange a discussion. And don't just say, look, I found drugs in your room. Try and engage, do an activity, maybe when you're having dinner or going out to the park or going getting ice cream, and then say, look, I found this is what I found. What's the explanation? Is this something that you're affected with? Just have a open conversation, and they're more likely to open up. And it really depends on the individual. So some people, it can take over their life, and other people, they might be smoking 1 or 2 joints on the weekend or something. So it really depends on. So that information you need to elicit from your son or your daughter, and then you need to talk about from an Islamic perspective. Look, this is haram, but let's move forward and think about solutions, because I think people tend to focus on the act itself by using drugs, but not on the solutions. And the solutions are what's going to help the young person. Look, we love you. It doesn't matter that you've fallen into this issue. We're here to support. We understand the pressures that young people are going through. And we want to work with you because this is something that's going to damage your iman, it's going to damage your family life, it's going to damage your future. And build on, like, each individual has strengths. Like, okay, if you continue using drugs, if you're an athlete, that's going to affect your your future as an athlete. Or if you want to go to a particular college or university, maybe your academic standards will fall. Maybe later on, if it's a girl thinking about marriage and things like that, these kind of stigmatizing issues may affect your future. These kind of conversations are really helpful. And then seeking specialist intervention, going to a substance misuse service, and because there's something called the 12-step program. I think a lot of people would have heard about it. And this is a psychological intervention, usually done by drug counselors or addiction counselors, and they use it, which can be helpful as well. So sometimes young people need specialist input. Sometimes, particularly with opioids or alcohol dependency, they will need medication. So they need to see an addiction psychiatrist or an addiction physician, and maybe they need some opioid substitute treatment. So it's like depends on the individual case, to be honest, and what substance they're using.
Well, I was taking notes of the steps you're laying out. We're going to go back through them, and each,
Sure.
we might need to do a future episode because each one of those things,
Yeah.
like you laid out a general process, then each one of those things, it's like you need to brainstorm, reflect a little bit about how to do it, because there's skilled ways and unskilled ways to interact with people. Now you mentioned two questions. One, we'll address this first. You mentioned the 12 Steps program.
Yeah.
Do you know the book Milati Islami, I believe it's called?
No, I've not come across that.
I actually know. Actually, the mother of one of my students actually started a organization here that's it's called Nia Recovery. If you're in Minnesota, brothers and sisters, you can look it up. It's focused on drug rehab, especially in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, where it's entirely populated by Somalis. And the sister who started it, it's faith-based recovery. Milati Islami is, I've not read it myself yet. I do have the book because the sister gave it to me, so I've been meaning to go through it. You should go through it too, because it's essentially a 12-step modification for Muslims, an Islamic modification. I have, I do know one thing about 12 steps, because I think they teach you in that you have to think of yourself as, you have to think of your addiction as being something permanent. Like you're always going to be an addict, and I think I've heard some students of knowledge say that's not Islamic, like you can actually fully recover. But so I wanted to ask about, what about, I mean, how important is it for, I guess you said each situation is unique. Yes. How important is for family members to talk about how it's affecting them? Because maybe that's not where you want to begin. You want to begin more with how it's affecting, or how you see it affecting the individual themselves. And, they can get sort of a view of your perspective that's outside their own head.
There's something called motivational interviewing, which is a strategy, is actually an intervention which has got increasing evidence base in mental health interventions and interventions for substance abuse. And I would recommend educators and parents to read up on motivational interviewing, which is an interviewing kind of style where, rather than telling the person what you've observed in terms of behaviors and what the solutions are, you try and motivate that person to come up with their own ideas around, okay, what do they see as the negative impact of drugs on their life, and what do they think are the solutions. So it's a really good intervention, which I would recommend, and it's quite straightforward. It's not difficult. There's a lot of now workbooks that you can use as well. So rather than starting off by saying, look, I feel that your drug use is affecting us as a family like this, I think it's more important to start off with getting that young person or family member to reflect on their own life and how substance abuse is causing. They may have some positive as well. They might say, look, and this is another thing, one of the reasons that people use drugs is self-medication. So somebody who's depressed or who maybe has undiagnosed ADHD, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they may use cannabis as self-medication because they're not able to, they're very impulsive, they're not able to sleep, maybe they're for anxiety and depression. They're
Yeah,
self-medicating with marijuana and alcohol.
I've
You know,
known people who claimed it helped their concentration. Like they were in college, they felt like their concentration on their schoolwork improved.
yeah. So there is so ADHD, which has treatments, which are medical treatments. If you don't treat them, some people, actually not some people, a lot of people do report that marijuana helps them focus and concentrate, but that's the wrong treatment, you know. So they first of all they need to get diagnosed, and then they need proper medical treatment. But yes, it can be beneficial in that way.
And this is where the some benefit, but the harm outweighs
Yeah,
the benefit verse comes in,
exactly. Yeah,
and our kids need to know this. Okay, we're gonna go back through the steps and just talk a little bit. So first, you said take time for yourself. The purpose of this is so you do not have a brash reaction.
yes,
Okay, so if
yeah,
someone, this is when you first find out. Some families, if they've maybe already gone through this, because they found out and they already did this. You know what I'm saying? I mean, this is what I've had with talking to kids, like, because I talk so much about being calm in my parenting course, you know, and
mm,
then I talk to parents, they're like, I appreciate what you told me. I haven't been being calm for 10 years. So now, you know, like, now what do I do? So, I
mhm.
mean, is it appropriate to apologize then, you know, or you know, what's a sensitive way to reach back out if that has taken place already?
Do you mean, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's always young people always appreciate honesty and recognition. I mean, everybody does, but it's unusual for a parent or an adult to say, "Look, I apologize. Maybe I reacted in an inappropriate way. I know you were going through a difficult time, but you know, and if we could go back, I would act differently." So yes, I think it's always good to apologize for behavior which you might have changed if you're able to go back in time. And I
Mhm.
think that builds that relationship and communication with your child or with your family member. I think that's really key. The other thing is also is like I mentioned, kind of motivational interviewing style to speak to them, and then yeah, together writing things down is always helpful because you know young people they don't want to really talk, right? Especially adolescents. So I think it's really helpful to give homework both to the individual who's suffering from the substance abuse issue and the family. Is look, let's write down what are the positives and what are the negatives from this behavior that you're engaging in
Mhm.
on you as an individual and on us as a family, and then let's come back maybe a day later or 2 days later and reflect on what we've written down, and that's really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The writing stuff down, you know, that's a big, you know, especially when you have these relationships and has been these emotional knots built up or these defense walls built up. It can really be a good way of releasing some of the tension there, you know,
Yes.
and you can write something out that you can draft a few times, you know, and writing, you know, reflective writing. Sorry. Of course, I teach reflective writing in school. You know, reflective writing is really a way to get deeper into your thoughts, your heart, and your
Yeah.
soul. You know, because a lot of times I think this communication, you have to communicate the deep care for them that you have out front. You know, I think sometimes with older children, you know, writing something to them where you mention like something you remember about when they were a young baby or this type of thing, you know, those things that can trigger the soft emotions back, that type of thing, you know, to let you know, because adolescents become very defensive, you know, so you want to pre-front some of the communication in a way that's going to not have those defense walls put up.
Yeah.
So you know, the writing it out really gives you a chance to reflect on it. I think it's a good idea. You know, probably sending an email works well these days, but I even think if you know it's more kind of more personally, write it out on paper and give it to the person and say, "Here, I want you to read it." Or if they live separately, you can mail it to their address or this type of thing.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and sometimes too, even if you write something out, and even if it's not the way you do things, so it's just not comfortable to deliver them a piece of writing, writing it out at least, it helps you arrange your own thoughts better. So then if you
Exactly.
do talk to them, you're gonna be a little more adept at it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so even like art therapy, we use art therapy within addiction services, even in the Muslim countries. So people who struggle to express their emotions and tends to be stereotypically males,
Mhm,
um, it's helpful to you know for them to actually not if they've struggled even to write, they can even draw like you know kind of thought bubbles and like you know what the thoughts are, or they it's a therapeutic kind of piece of
mhm.
work, but also it helps to build that relationship. So I think yeah, encouraging younger kids to maybe draw something about how they're feeling, drawing, characters that they know from cartoons, and like, using non-verbal kind of interventions is helpful as well. Yeah.
Okay, ranging a discussion. My question for this: is it beneficial to have? I mean, first of all, do we want to be deceitful with this? Like, do we want to say, hey, I'm going to invite you over for dinner Saturday, and then we're going to pop it on them that we actually want to talk about this? Maybe that's not deceitful, it's just tactful. Or do we want to say, okay, we want to talk about what's going on with you, and we're going to do this time and place. Also, too, what about the amount of people? Because, again, I mentioned to you right before we went on the live, like some of the feedback I got from people when because I put up an Instagram question box for people to ask questions. Some of the impressions that I got from that were that people have tried things with people, but they're doing it solo. So it's like, they're the one person concerned. How much does it benefit to get like the whole family on board, or both mom and dad on board, and several people for that discussion? How much should you be concerned with that?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think, again, it goes back to case by case basis. So every individual is different. Even every child is different. It's quite a sensitive issue, stigmatizing for the individual and for the family. So I usually find the lesser the number of people involved in that initial discussion, the better. Because, say, for example, you've got the parent, mother, father, and maybe two brothers and a sister, and an auntie and an uncle and a cousin. That the more people you have, the more likely things are to go wrong, because the individual who's going through that might think, look, I'm being ambushed by all these family members. It's something that I feel ashamed of, and why did my mom have to involve all these other people? So I think the better strategy usually, although not always, is to have one or two people speak to the youth on a personal level, and then if they feel that they need support, I think it's always important to get consent from the young person as much as possible, because most people will say, look, I don't want other people to know about this. I just want to keep it between us. And I think that's usually better strategy than to involve other people. And like, I don't know about kind of your experience, but South Asian community and even the Arab community, things get blown out of proportion, and then say if an auntie or an uncle is there, they'll go and start saying, oh, look, your cousin's using drugs, and then it spreads, that misinformation, and then suddenly, okay, this guy had smoked cannabis for a week, turns out to be, he's injecting heroin, or he's, a drunk or something. Chinese whispers. So I think it's better to keep it, within a close-knit kind of family structure.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point in those types of cultural dynamics that you pointed out. Because I'm actually thinking of situations I know concerning Caucasian families. White Americans, like their communities are not so interconnected socially, like Arab and South Asian communities, Somali communities, this type of thing. So you don't necessarily have that quick word spreading fast, this type of thing. And actually, I'm thinking about it where it was like kind of the older father of the family who had this issue, and he was known to be very, very stubborn. So like actually this type of intervention was done kind of to shock that person into realizing like you have a problem and you have to accept it. So that's maybe something you need to calculate with it as well. Like, to what extent are they likely to acknowledge their problem? And it might just be persistence, use of the next step that I'm putting up, which you mentioned, asking for an explanation in a sensitive way. So I'm not sure I have a specific question to that, but I put sensitive way in there because I think the important point here is you want to get to their root cause that's going on, because oftentimes it is filling some sort of emotional need or this type of thing. And I will say too, with high schoolers, I have known kids who they were, like a type of kid who's nice with everybody. So they had enough social connections that they were maybe around kids who did drugs a few times, and maybe they even did it once or twice, but then they never did it again. I have known kids who have gone through that, but those kids, they always had like a very positive, confident self-concept, and they were successful in other areas. Not that those type of kids can't fall into it, but they weren't trying. There was no emotional need for them to fill. So I think what this part really gets to is trying to find the underlying cause and not be
Yeah.
like, again, not shaming, not like, tell me why you're doing this type of thing.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on it already, but yeah, being supportive rather than destructive, which is really challenging as a parent. Um, like I mentioned, the data, the research shows that people use drugs for a variety of reasons. So they may be going through a depressive episode which you haven't recognized, because adolescents going through depression is not what we normally think of as a depressed person. It might be they're more irritable, or they're more isolating themselves rather than, but still functioning to a level, but they're going through a severe depressive episode, or maybe they feel suicidal, and that's why they're self-medicating with drugs. There's also an association with trauma. So maybe, subhanallah, some people have experienced sexual abuse as children, and to kind of, get rid of those traumatic memories, they're using drugs. And maybe the Muslim family are unaware. Unfortunately, within the education system or within kind of extracurricular clubs, there have been cases where kids have been sexually abused, and they either end up with severe suicidal behavior, or they might engage in drug use to forget those traumatic memories. So can you imagine if your child, God forbid, may Allah protect our children, goes through that, and on top of that, as a parent, you start kind of harassing your child and kind of lambasting them. That's going to damage them irreparably, because you're supposed to be protecting your child, right? So I think parents need to be much more savvy about what are the reasons that young people use drugs. It's not just always for partying. There may be other serious underlying health issues, abuse, and maybe they're getting bullied at school. This is also very common. I'm sure you've seen this as well. Bullying is resulting in low self-esteem, low self-confidence, and then they stop using drugs because it makes them feel better, or it helps them get rid of the pain, that emotional pain that they're suffering from. So this is why the first intervention as a family member is key, to make sure you act in a supportive way rather than a destructive, authoritarian kind of, oh, how could you shame us, and I'm so disappointed in you. These kind of attitudes can make things really bad and worse for the child.
At risk of sidetracking, brother, because you brought up a really good point about trauma, and of course, I work in an area where we have the highest population of East Africans,
Yeah,
of any place in the diaspora, and they're not the only ones, but we have a lot of people. Sadly, we have lots of Muslims worldwide who've been through the
yeah,
refugee experience and who've been through trauma from war and this type of
yeah,
thing. Do you know
yeah.
anything? I mean, does that make anyone more likely and again, that type of trauma can be generational as well, correct?
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, I've been working with a couple of medical professionals in Syria remotely, and because the trauma of war, the trauma of oppression, etc., and for example, in Palestine, that really can affect somebody's psychological well-being to the point where some people have tried to commit suicide, taking overdoses, and other people have started using drugs. So yes, there's definitely a link between that kind of trauma, seeing your family members get killed, or serious injury, maybe kids becoming orphans. That is a risk factor for substance abuse as well. So yeah, definitely.
And I've seen, I'm not an expert at all, but I have seen research, studying the situations of refugees. I think it's actually stuff that was studied in succeeding generations of Holocaust survivors that
Yeah,
shows similar genetic variations in genes associated with depression and anxiety.
yeah,
So, like, I think there is literature out there about the
yes,
extent to which that type of trauma can be generational. So, something to keep in mind, some for all of us to keep in mind for the Muslims, just to be patient with one another, because Muslims have put through a lot in a lot of different ways.
yes, yeah,
Okay, we wanted to go for about an hour, so I'm gonna just shuffle through quickly. We talked, you talked about solution plan from an Islamic perspective, and we talked about the evidence in Islam being that things do need to be predicated on iman.
yeah,
So this is really something which with recovery about the importance of environmental change usually, and this is the big thing I see with young people a lot of the time.
mhm,
It's hard to really change your habits when you're stuck in an environment where that's the
yes,
habits that you're doing. And if
yeah,
you're stuck in a social group, especially where this is what you do, and adolescents are very emotionally attached to their social group usually, it's hard to get out of that. And this is part of why rehabilitation centers are structured the way they are. You
Yes.
stay isolated from whatever environment you were doing it all in is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So just to build on that, one of the interventions we do in recovery is basically ask the individual talk about their peer group, who are their friends, how many of their friends are abusing substances, do they have any peers or friends who don't use drugs, and to change that friendship group. And this is even from a non-Muslim perspective as well, because Subhanallah, again, our Deen teaches us the solution. So Allah, at the Prophet ﷺ, there's many hadith about the importance of friends. So one hadith which is famous is, your friends, you are on the deen of your friends, right? So he gave the parable of bad friends as somebody who works with metal, a blacksmith, and if you go into that area, you'll come out kind of dark, covered in soot, maybe it's not smelling nice, and that's the example of bad friends. So the more you spend time with bad friends, the more likely you're to be affected in terms of your iman and also your general behavior. And then he gave the example of friends as the one who sells oud or perfume. If you go in that shop, even if you don't buy it, you'll come out smelling nice. So you'll be affected by good friends. So this is why I mentioned that as parents, we need to be vigilant about our children, who are they associating with, who are their friends, and try and get them, friends who remind each other about Salah and the importance of the Islamic identity, which might not always be doable depending on which part of the world you're living in. But to the best of your ability, it's really important to have good friendship groups, and that's the intervention. So change the friendship group, change your mobile phone if you're using that for purchasing substances or dealing, and then you work on that. And the other thing is, I think it's really important to say that there's no quick solution. This is a long-term issue, and I've been treating patients for years. It's a chronic relapsing remitting issue for some people, unfortunately. It depends at which stage you intervene. So you divide interventions into kind of early interventions and then treat, right?
Yeah.
Early intervention is like we talked about, empowering our youth to understand the harms of drugs. And if they do start using, then, having certain family-based interventions. But then if it gets to the point where they become dependent on alcohol or opioids, that is a very long journey. We're talking, years. I'm treating patients for 10 years who are still having periods of abstinence and then relapsing, abstinence and relapsing. So parents need to realize that it's not a quick solution. It's not something that overnight your child will, stop using drugs.
And I feel like the change of environment thing, like it's really hard for people to facilitate.
Yeah.
And parents, not just Muslim parents, but parents, a lot of times they have a problem of always wanting to export what their child needs to someone else. You want to export their education to someone else. You want to export their social activities to someone else, this type of thing. And even me, like as I've been doing this YouTube channel, I get parents contacting me asking me if I will talk to their kid about this or that. But it's like, you haven't talked to them about this for years. You need to talk to them about it. Not that specialists can't do that, like they can. But when it comes to changing the kid's environment, this is something parents, I think, need to understand. Like you are going to have to invest some of your own resources in it,
Yes.
and probably
Yeah.
mainly your time, because you're gonna,
Yes.
if you want to ask them to go away from a certain crowd of people, the question becomes, well, okay, what do I do instead? So
What's
you
the
have,
alternative?
right. So
Yeah.
you have to try to fill that vacuum. Now if you've
Yeah.
gotten distance from them, it could be something where you're set up to do some reconnecting with them, especially if you're supportive. You need, if we're trying to rebuild their iman, taking them to the masjid, maybe reading a book together. That's the thing too. If the parents themselves are not perfect with the deen, and none of us are, of course, it can maybe become something where we try together to get better in the religion and this type of thing. I think
Yeah.
that type of stuff is the thing we need to think creatively
That,
about.
that is a really important point, because what we know from child development is children learn from copying their parents, right, and from their adults. Now, a lot of the cases that I've seen and I've treated, unfortunately, the home environment isn't the best environment. So maybe the mother is working, I don't know, 12 hours a day, right? The father is working, and so the child is basically spending most of their time in school or with their friends, right? And the early part of development, the first, I would say maybe 5 years, is crucial in terms of developing that secure attachment with that primary caregiver. So if the mother has been working, and it's not attacking women who work, sometimes the situation demands financially, it's not possible. but the primary role really is for, I'm focusing here on the mother's role, is to develop that nurturing bond with their child. And then the father is a male role model. So we know from the evidence base that children look to their fathers, particularly boys, in terms of positive role models. So if the father themselves is, for example, smoking, is not praying their salah, is or lazy with their salah, hasn't got the attachment with the masjid, maybe even some of the parents, fathers are drinking alcohol as well, that's a recipe for disaster, right? So it's kind of like, okay, you're telling me to stop smoking cigarettes, but you're smoking yourself, you know?
So this means there can be a big self-accountability piece on the part of the parents, maybe when the situation comes up. And
Yeah.
I've seen that too. And many working class families, they're just burdened with this, where, you know, one parent works afternoon to the evening, the other parent works overnight to the morning. You know, you never have, you know, just some families are in that situation. But
Yeah.
when things get to this, like, you know, sometimes again, expending your own resources might mean you have to work less to be able to
Yes.
spend more time with that person, to be
Yeah.
able to provide a consistent alternate environment for them. You know,
You
that's
see,
part of the
yeah, you
part
see,
of the reality of it.
I think because we live in a world where people are competing in terms of wealth, al-hakumut takathur, as Allah says in the Quran. So
Mhm.
people want to portray to the outside world that, look, we have more money, and they kind of working themselves to the bone. But yeah, okay, that's fine. But you need to invest in the iman of your children and preserve their iman. That's more important than financial
Yeah.
kind of. Yes, it's important to be able to, you know, live a comfortable life, but there comes a point where you have to stop or reduce your working hours to save the iman of your children.
Mhm.
What's the point of becoming rich if your child loses their iman? And I've seen this, by the way, in the UK. Unfortunately, people, particularly the South Asian community, they have shops and they're working. The husband and wife are working basically 24 hours a day,
Mm.
7 days a week, and then their daughters end up marrying non-Muslim men.
SubhanAllah.
And then the next step is their children have no idea about Islam. They
Right.
completely leave Islam.
Right.
So, you know, so it's a really kind of, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, save yourself and your family from the fire.
SubhanAllah. So we didn't want to go too much over an hour. I know, brother, you know, we talked about being empathetic. We talked to them how to affect their strengths. Two things I want to get to before we go quickly. So we said about seeking a specialist. Now, I mean, do you recommend that you do some of this direct action with the family member before you try to go to a specialist?
Yeah, because most of the addiction services require voluntary consent from the patient. So if you go to see a specialist without informing your family member, your son, your daughter, it's a recipe for disaster, and you can't force somebody into treatment unless obviously they present as a risk to themselves or others. But yeah, so I think this is the story. Again, I think we should do another episode some other time. But one of the problems is that parents are like, even some parents, they contact me for advice, and they're like, look, I haven't told my son or daughter that I'm speaking to you. Can you just like randomly ring them and say, oh yeah, I'm a friend of a family of your family, and
getting over. Sorry.
covertly tackle this issue. I'm like, look,
Right.
you need to speak. You need to be open and honest with.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Getting over fear of confrontation is maybe a big part of it. You know, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So the point we'll end on, AA in the chat asks, please consider discussing behavioral addiction like gaming and pornography. So, I mean, can you touch on that quickly, like the extent to which this relates to those and the extent to maybe which they're divergent? There have been lots of Muslim channels I know who have talked about illicit content on the internet. I personally don't like to even say that word. You know, Gabriel Romani, who introduced us to one another, he's talked lots about that on his channel, this type of thing. I'll just say to anyone watching, but can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it's slightly different than substance abuse. I mean, the neurobiology is similar, and it's related to dopamine and the pleasure related to release of dopamine. But gaming and illicit material, sexually explicit material, the treatment of that is very generic. There's not really specific interventions, and it's kind of general behavioral interventions, which maybe we can talk about, because I think it's a big area to discuss. Again, prevention is better than cure. Changing your environment, teaching, access to, internet, parents supervising and being vigilant with their children's internet use, and also pornography. I know you don't like the word,
That's
but
fine.
as parents, as Muslim parents, we make the haram easy and the halal difficult. If our children are mature enough psychologically, we need to get them married. How are males and females in their 30s still not married in a non-Muslim in a non-Muslim community? Either they're engaging in homosexual acts, or they're committing zina, or they're fulfilling their sexual desires in a haram way, right? So it's unnatural. So one of the solutions, in my opinion, is to get our children married as young as possible, especially those living in non-Muslim communities where they're being bombarded by sexually explicit material, and everybody has a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and they're made to feel ostracized when they're not engaging in illicit relationships.
I totally agree. Jazakallah khair, brother. Before we go, can you just tell how can people keep track of you? How can, probably there's a lot of people want to contact you as well. Can you?
Yeah.
I know you have a YouTube channel.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I think you shared the link before. Perhaps you can share it. I don't know if you still got it there. But the best way to contact me is through email, which is abuisao@gmail.com. And inshallah, I'll try and get back to people, because I do get a lot of emails, so sometimes there's a bit of a delay in responding. But yeah, that's the best way to get in touch with me.
Let's spell out the email. ABU
EESA
ESA
O
O
@gmail.com.
@gmail.com. So we're going to put that up on the banner. You can see it right now, how to get in touch with the brother. I did link to your channel on your YouTube channel on my Instagram, and I think I tagged it in a community post that I put on YouTube, so people can find your YouTube channel that way. Jazakumullah khairan. Can you do the closing dua for us, brother, too, please?
Yeah, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wasalam Rasulullah. Jazakallah khair, Michael. May Allah bless you, and may Allah bless all of you who watch this content. Inshallah, we'll plan to do some more episodes and try and benefit the Muslim community as much as possible.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.